Welcome, traveler time. You've entered a realm where kings rise, empires fall, and every crown carries a curse. Today, we journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating monarchs, where love, power, and destiny intertwine. The story begins in the ashes of a fallen empire. The Roman world, once the beating heart of civilization, had long crumbled into chaos. Across the fields of Western Europe, warlords and tribal kings fought for scraps of glory, each claiming the right to rule the ruins of Rome. Yet, among them rose a man whose ambition reached beyond the sword, a man destined to rebuild what time had destroyed. His name was Charles, son of Pepin the Short, heir to the Frankish throne, but the world would remember him as Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great. Born around 742 AD, Charles entered a Europe divided by fear and greed. The Frankish kingdom, though powerful, was fractured by rival factions, restless nobles, and endless wars. When his father Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was divided between Charles and his brother Charlemagne, an uneasy balance that would soon collapse. While Charlemagne sought peace, Charles burned with the fire of conquest. 2 years later, Charlemagne's sudden death, some whispered of poison, others of fate, left Charles sole ruler of the Franks. From that moment, a single vision took hold of his heart: to forge a new empire from the chaos of tribes and kingdoms. But Charlemagne was no mere conqueror. He was a craftsman of nations, a weaver of faith and sword. His power grew not only through battle, but through belief, for he saw himself as the chosen protector of Christendom. And so, his campaigns began, first in Aquitaine, then in Lombardy, where he shattered the iron crown of the Lombard kings and took it for his own. Italy knelt before him, and the Pope, seeing divine purpose in his strength, blessed him as the defender of the Church. Charlemagne's rise was not built solely on blood, but on a vision of order. He established laws, built roads, and revived the schools and libraries left to rot since Rome's fall. Scholars from across the continent gathered in his court at Aachen, transforming it into a beacon of learning, the spark of what history would call the Carolingian Renaissance. Yet even as light returned to Europe, darkness lingered beyond its borders. Pagan tribes in Saxony defied his rule, raiding Christian lands and rejecting his faith. For 3 decades, Charlemagne waged brutal war against them, a campaign not only of conquest, but of conversion. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and thousands were baptized under the shadow of the sword. To some, he was a holy emperor. To others, a tyrant cloaked in the cross. Through it all, his determination never wavered. Every victory, every alliance, every act of faith pushed him closer to his destiny, to unite Europe under one crown, one faith, and one name. The dream of Rome reborn was no longer a whisper of the past. It was alive, breathing once more in the heart of the Frankish king. By the year 800, Charlemagne's dominion stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the Baltic to the Italian plains. And on Christmas Day of that year, inside the Grand Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and declared him emperor of the Romans. In that moment, history shifted. The Middle Ages had found its titan. Charlemagne's empire was more than territory. It was an idea that power and piety could coexist, that civilization could rise again from barbarism. But as the bells of Rome rang in his glory, seeds of betrayal and legacy were already being sown, for even the greatest empires cast the longest shadows. As dawn broke over the misty forests of Saxony, the echo of drums carried through the trees. Charlemagne's armies moved like an iron tide, shields glinting, banners fluttering beneath the gray skies. For more than 30 years, these forests had been his crucible. Here, he fought not just for land, but for souls. The Saxons, fierce and unyielding, refused to bow to the cross. To them, Charlemagne was not a savior, but a destroyer, a foreign king forcing his god upon their ancient gods. And yet, Charlemagne saw no difference between conquest and conversion. To rule, one must unite. To unite, one must believe. His wars were sermons written in blood. Each campaign brought both triumph and tragedy. Entire villages were burned in defiance. Thousands of captives were baptized at the edge of rivers, or slain if they refused. The most infamous of these acts came in 782, when Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon rebels at Verdun after a rebellion. Chroniclers called it justice. History called it a massacre. But in Charlemagne's mind, this was the price of destiny. He saw himself as God's hammer, forging faith from chaos. His empire would not be built upon diplomacy alone. It required fear, loyalty, and divine order. And so, through decades of relentless warfare, the Saxon lands were finally subdued. The cross was raised where once only the hammer of Thor had reigned. Yet Charlemagne's conquests were not confined to the battlefield. He built bridges, fortified cities, and demanded that schools be founded in every corner of his realm. Priests, nobles, and peasants alike were required to learn. For knowledge, he said, was the weapon of peace. It was an idea centuries ahead of its time. In his capital at Aachen, a new Rome began to rise. The Palatine Chapel, with its gleaming marble and golden mosaics, stood as both palace and temple, a symbol of faith and power intertwined. Scholars from distant lands gathered there. Alcuin of York from England, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Einhard, his devoted chronicler. Together, they shaped what would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance, a rebirth of learning, law, and art under the shadow of the emperor's sword. But beneath the brilliance of his rule, the emperor was haunted by solitude. He had many wives and children, yet few he truly trusted. His court was a labyrinth of ambition. Nobles schemed, bishops whispered, and his sons grew restless under the weight of his legend. For Charlemagne, family was both his legacy and his curse. Still, his will was unbreakable. He rode across mountains and rivers, through winters so cruel they froze armies in their tracks, always driven by the same vision: a unified Christian empire under one faith, one law, and one crown. By the end of his wars, the map of Europe had changed forever. Charlemagne's dominion stretched across more than half the continent. He had subdued the Saxons, humbled the Lombards, and driven the Moors from the borders of Christendom. He was emperor not by birthright, but by sheer force of destiny. And yet, as his power grew, so too did the burden of his faith. Could one man truly rule by the will of God? Or was that belief the most dangerous illusion of all? As the emperor stood before his army, gazing into the endless forest that had taken so much of his life, he must have wondered if the wars he fought had saved souls, or simply silenced them. In the quiet heart of Aachen, far from the roar of battle, a new kind of empire was being forged, not by sword or siege, but by mind and spirit. Charlemagne, the warrior king, now sought to build a realm that would outlive him, one not carved in blood, but in knowledge. The emperor had seen too many kingdoms rise and crumble under the weight of ignorance. Even his own court was filled with nobles who could neither read the decrees they swore to uphold nor write their own names. Faith without understanding is fragile, he once declared. And so began one of the greatest transformations in medieval Europe, the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne summoned the finest minds of the age to his court. From England came Alcuin of York, a scholar and theologian whose brilliance lit the emperor's vision like a flame. From Italy came Paul the Deacon. From Spain came Theodulf of Orleans. And from across the empire came monks, scribes, and philosophers, each bringing fragments of wisdom that had nearly vanished with Rome's fall. Within the marble halls of Aachen, learning was reborn. Scriptoria, rooms where monks labored by candlelight, filled with the sound of quills scratching parchment. Ancient texts were copied, preserved, and illuminated with gold and color. Charlemagne decreed that schools should be attached to every monastery and cathedral, where boys, whether noble or common, could learn grammar, logic, and the Word of God. He believed that literacy was not a privilege, but a weapon, one that could defend faith and order as surely as any blade. His empire began to breathe with the rhythm of a new age. laws standardized, prayers unified, and a written Latin refined to bridge the vast lands under his rule. Yet, for all his grandeur, Charlemagne was not a distant figure of divine authority. He was a man who walked among his people, who listened, judged, and ruled with both mercy and iron. Chroniclers described him as tall and broad, his voice commanding, his presence magnetic. He dressed simply, disdaining jewels and silks, preferring the woolen tunic of a Frankish soldier. But beneath his humility was an unshakable sense of destiny. He saw himself not just as king of the Franks, but as the heir of Rome, a bridge between the ancient world and the Christian future. The very architecture of his palace reflected that dream, a fusion of Roman majesty and northern strength, crowned by the octagonal dome of his chapel, an earthly echo of heaven's perfection. Still, even as his empire flourished, its foundations trembled with unseen cracks. To rule so vast a realm required trust, and trust was the rarest currency of all. His counts and dukes governed distant provinces, their loyalty often more fragile than their oaths. To maintain control, Charlemagne created missi dominici, royal envoys who traveled the empire to enforce justice, inspect governance, and remind the nobles that the emperor's gaze never wavered. But no law could bind ambition forever. Rivalries brewed in the shadows of his court. Some whispered that the emperor's reforms favored the church too much, that bishops held more sway than swords. Others murmured that his wars had drained the treasury and wearied the people. Charlemagne knew the cost of empire was not only written in coin or blood, but in time. Every decision was a gamble with eternity, a choice that would echo through generations. And still, he dreamed of more. Beyond his borders, the Muslim caliphates thrived, the Byzantine Empire glittered with ancient power, and the Vikings in the north were beginning to stir. Europe was not yet at peace. The emperor's mission to unite Christendom remained unfinished. One winter night, as snow blanketed Aachen and the bells of the chapel rang softly, Charlemagne stood before the altar and prayed. His hair, now silvered with age, glowed in the candlelight. He prayed not for victory, nor for wealth, but for wisdom, that his people might endure after he was gone. For even in greatness, he understood a truth few kings ever grasped. Empires are mortal, but ideas, faith, knowledge, unity can live forever. As the empire reached its height, the golden light of Charlemagne's reign began to cast long and uneasy shadows. For every victory carved in marble, there was a whisper of rebellion in the wind. The emperor had built a world too vast for any one man to hold, and even as he dreamed of eternity, time itself began to betray him. His sons, his flesh, his legacy became his greatest source of sorrow. Charlemagne, though blessed with many children, struggled to divide his affection as he had once divided his empire. His eldest, Pepin the Hunchback, deformed since birth, was denied succession, a decision that festered into resentment. In 792, when Pepin joined a conspiracy against his father, Charlemagne's heart was shattered. The rebellion failed, and the emperor, torn between mercy and duty, ordered his son to be tonsured and confined to a monastery. The father who had conquered kingdoms could not conquer the cruelty of fate. His other sons, Charles the Younger, Carloman, later called Pepin of Italy, and Louis, each received territories to govern, for the emperor believed in sharing the burden of rule. But division, even born of love, breeds ambition. As they matured, the seeds of rivalry took root. Brothers became rivals, courtiers became conspirators, and the empire began to whisper its first tremors of disunity. Charlemagne's daughters, by contrast, remained at his side. He adored them deeply, refusing to marry them off to foreign kings, for he could not bear to lose them. This defiance of custom scandalized the church and the nobility, but Charlemagne cared little for their judgment. In his court, his daughters were not pawns of alliance, but jewels of affection. Though some historians suggest their lives, too, were marked by quiet tragedy, bound forever to their father's towering shadow. Yet even amid personal grief, Charlemagne's sense of duty never faltered. He continued to govern with discipline and vision, his reforms shaping law, education, and faith across the continent. But the weight of empire pressed harder with each passing year. Reports of Viking raids came from the north, longships haunting the coasts like phantoms. In the east, the Slavs and Avars tested his borders, and within, the nobility grew restless beneath the iron rule of the emperor's justice. The once invincible warrior now fought a different kind of battle, not of sword and shield, but of legacy. Could his empire, so carefully forged, survive him? Could his vision of a united Christendom endure the greed and pride of men? Einhard, his loyal chronicler, wrote of these final years with reverence and sorrow. He described an emperor who had grown old, but not weak, whose mind remained as sharp as the steel of his youth. Charlemagne spent more time in prayer, attending daily mass, studying scripture, and walking the cloisters of his beloved chapel in Aachen. The same man who once commanded armies of thousands now found peace in the silence of a single candle's flame. And yet, the shadow of mortality loomed closer. In his 71st year, Charlemagne fell ill. The great halls that once rang with laughter and debate grew silent. His courtiers stood in hushed fear as their emperor, the man who had united a continent, began to fade. On January 28, 814, he called his son Louis the Pious to his side, spoke to him of duty and faith, and whispered his final prayer. When the bells of Aachen tolled that morning, the sound carried across the empire, from the frozen forests of Saxony to the sunlit fields of Provence. The king was dead, but in death, as in life, Charlemagne was larger than a man. He was a myth reborn. They buried him in his chapel at Aachen, not upon a bed, but seated on his throne, wearing his crown, his sword across his lap, as though he merely rested between battles. His tomb became a shrine, his name a legend whispered in the centuries that followed. Yet even as his empire began to fracture under his successors, his spirit endured. The Holy Roman emperors who came after him, from Otto the Great to Frederick Barbarossa, would look to Charlemagne as their divine ancestor. Kings of France and Germany alike traced their bloodlines to him, invoking his legacy as both sword and shield. Charlemagne's reign had not only reshaped Europe, it had redefined what kingship meant. No longer was power measured only by conquest, but by creation of laws, learning, and unity. He had built not merely an empire, but an idea, one that would echo through the ages. And though the centuries would erode his borders and blur his lineage, one truth would remain unbroken. He had been the father of a continent, the architect of a dream. Centuries have passed since Charlemagne's heart last beat within the marble halls of Aachen, yet his shadow still lies across Europe like a silent crown. Time, that great thief, has taken kings, empires, and armies, but it has never taken him. In the generations that followed his death, his empire splintered. Sons fought sons, kingdoms broke apart, and the unity he had forged through faith and fire dissolved into rival thrones. The Carolingian dynasty, once radiant as the morning sun, dimmed into twilight. But even as his world faded, his memory grew stronger, a paradox that only true legends achieve. Monks began to write of him not as a man, but as the emperor of the last days, a ruler chosen by God to prepare the world for salvation. In the epics of France and Germany, Charlemagne became a larger-than-life figure, the hero of the Song of Roland, the avenger of Christendom, the king who slept beneath the earth awaiting his return in the hour of Europe's need. Historians sought the truth of his life, but poets found his soul. They wrote of a man who could bend destiny, who could summon both fear and faith with the same glance. His wars became parables, his laws became gospel, and his crown, once of gold, became a symbol of divine right. When Otto I revived the empire in 962, he did so in Charlemagne's name, calling his dominion the Holy Roman Empire, as if invoking the spirit of the first emperor could bless the new one. Even Napoleon, 1,000 years later, would place the imperial crown upon his head and whisper of Charlemagne, claiming his mantle as heir to the greatest of kings. But perhaps the truest measure of Charlemagne's legacy lies not in the monuments or empires that bore his name, but in the idea he left behind, the dream of a united Europe. A dream that would rise and fall through the ages, through crusades and reformations, through revolutions and wars. And though nations would be born and broken 100 times, the echo of that vision, one people, one faith, one destiny, would never fade. In the city of Aachen today, pilgrims and travelers still stand before the octagonal chapel that once held the emperor's gaze. His throne remains there, carved from marble older than his crown. And though centuries have stripped it of splendor, it holds something far greater: silence. The kind of silence that hums with memory. They say that when the wind passes through the chapel's arches, it sounds like a hymn. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear his voice, steady, commanding, eternal. The voice of a man who once turned chaos into order, who shaped a continent with faith and will, and who dared to dream beyond the limits of his age. Charlemagne's reign ended more than a millennium ago, but his story never truly closed. For in every cathedral's bell, in every border drawn by kings and treaties, in every tongue shaped by Latin's echo, there's a trace of him still. And so, when history whispers of empire, when it speaks of the bond between power and belief, when it asks who first dreamed of Europe as one, the answer is always the same. A king who became an emperor who became an idea, a man who became a legend. He was Charlemagne, the father of Europe. If you've journeyed this far through time, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep exploring the untold stories of kings, empires, and the destiny that binds them all.